Ode on a Grecian Urn by John Keats. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian who can thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme. What leaf-fringed legends haunt about thy shape, of mortals or deities or of both, in Tempe or the dales of Arcady? What men or gods are these? What maidens loathe? What mad pursuit? What struggle to escape? What pipes and timbrels? What wild ecstasy? Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore, ye soft pipes, play on, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared, pipe to the spirit ditties of no tone. Fair youth beneath the trees, thou cannot leave thy song, nor ever can those trees be bare. Bold lover, never, never canst thou kiss, though winning near the goal. Yet do not grieve, she cannot fade. Though thou hast not thy bliss, forever wilt thou love, and she be fair. Ah, happy, happy boughs, that cannot shed your leaves, nor ever bid the spring adieu. And happy melodist, unwearied, forever piping songs, forever new. More happy love, more happy, happy love, forever warm and still to be enjoyed, forever panting and forever young. All breathing human passion far above, that leaves a heart high sorrowful and cloyed, a burning forehead and a parching tongue. Who are these coming to the sacrifice? To what green altar, O mysterious priest, leadest thou that heifer lowing at the skies, with all her silken flanks with garlands dressed? What little town, by river or seashore, or mountain built with peaceful citadel, is emptied of its folk this pious morn? And little town, thy streets forevermore will silent be, and not a soul to tell why thou art desolate can e'er return. Oh, Attic shape, fair attitude, with breed of marble men and maidens overwrought with forest branches and the trodden weed, thou silent form doth tease us out of thought, as doth eternity. Cold pastoral. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woes than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth. Truth, beauty. That is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know.
This afternoon, I want to introduce you to a man whose work has been mentioned by Vladimir and LaRouche on many occasions as totally crucial for mankind, and who is a current focus of the LaRouche PAC basement team research. Vladimir Vernadsky is a Ukrainian-Russian scientist. His full name is Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky. He was the founder of the new branch of science known as biogeochemistry, which focuses on the effect of life on the chemistry of the earth. As most of you have been around for quite some time as key activists in the organisation, most of you probably recognise him as as Lynn refers to, recognising from the fact that he defines the universe as having three distinct phase spaces: the abiotic, the living, and the noetic, the realm of human reason. Lynn refers to Vernadsky in every one of his papers as these discoveries by Vernadsky, these discoveries of these phase spaces, are the true character of the world in which we live, not the one in which the green environmentalists believe we live in and are destroying. Since we all too often take what Lynn writes and says for granted, no one ever does that, do you? And skate over such concepts, accepting them as a priori, we know without question. The purpose of my presentation this afternoon is to give you a real sense of the importance of Vernadsky's work, a living, working understanding of his crucial ideas and approach. Vernadsky's life spans an extraordinary period of human history. Those of you who've studied the DVD 1932 will be familiar with it. Think of the span from the US Civil War to the end of World War II, from Abraham Lincoln to Franklin Roosevelt in the US, and from John Dunmore Lang to John Curtin here in our country. Vladimir Vernadsky was born into a family of Ukrainian intellectuals living in St. Petersburg in Russia in 1863, just 2 years after Tsar Alexander II's emancipation of the serfs. He died in the Soviet Union in the last year of World War II, 1945. During his lifetime came the horrific worldwide upheaval of World War I, which was caused by the British Empire's fearful and brutal response to the threatened spread of the so-called American system, nation-building economics throughout continental Europe and beyond, jeopardising the entire British imperial system of colonial enslavement and looting. Since British geopolitics hinged on pitting Germany against Russia, the Russia in which Vernadsky lived was devastated repeatedly during this time. Nearly 100,000 casualties Russia had suffered in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, and the 1905 revolution were just the beginning. Russia lost close to 5 million people in World War I, and then 10 million more in its 1918 to 21 civil war. Combined, that was already 8% of the estimated 175 million person population in the Russian Empire in 1913. Then came the upheavals of the Soviet period, with 15 to 20 million people killed in famine and internecine strife, much of course, which is instigated and manipulated from outside of Russia. And then you had another 20 to 30 million dead in the Second World War. Vernadsky's moral integrity in pursuing scientific breakthroughs for the benefit of his own country and mankind in the setting of such a holocaust is breathtaking. From every standpoint, scientific, moral and political, he is a towering figure. One of those like Dante Alighieri of the 1300 or Leibniz at the turn of the 17th and the 18th century, with whom LaRouche has been conducting a living dialogue throughout his own intervention into history. Accordingly, it is no surprise that throughout his life, during all the time Vernadsky was working on scientific matters, the scientific matters I shall outline this afternoon, he was simultaneously and often in connection with them intensely involved in shaping the economic policy of his country. Studying his life, I think Vernadsky's scientific work can be roughly divided into two periods. They're not discontinuous from his scientific viewpoint, and they do not coincide exactly with the shift of power inside Russia in 1917, but I wanted to find them around the period of 1922 to 24, when Vernadsky found a new focus in his scientific work, and also that work provoked major reactions from others, especially the British enemies of science. The first period of Vernadsky's scientific work extended from his early studies in Russia up until his lectures at the Sorbonne, that's the University of Paris, in France in 1922 to 23. At that time he spent with Marie Curie during his visit, as Gabby mentioned this morning. whilst in Paris in 1924, Vernadsky published his first major work in a Western European language, the book La Géochimie, as pronounced in French, or Geochemistry in English. Slightly later, his book, The Biosphere, came out in Russian in 1926 and in French in 1929. This represented the liberation of Vernadsky's ideas in a more profound and direct way into world thought. The Geochemistry was written from his lectures at the Sorbonne in geochemistry and mineralogy, presenting the accumulation of his work to that date. The lectures included his conception of the unique nature of life and living matter in the biosphere. In them, Vernadsky also talked about a new fact in history which did not exist in earlier epochs, the activity of civilized man. In other words, Vernadsky's lectures contained the germ of the concept he later called the Noösphere, the higher domain of human cognition and creativity. To give you an idea of the power of the ideas Vernadsky was presenting, I want to read you an excerpt from his essays on geochemistry. This is from a section called The Geochemical Activities of Man. It's contained in a 1967 edition published in the Soviet Union and then issued in an English translation in 2007. The exact date of when this passage was written is not known, but the editors identify the essays as an assembly of writings between 1922 and 33. So it characterises what Vernadsky was presenting in its essence at the Sorbonne, and which terrified the enemies of science and of humanity. He used the term psychozoic from the Greek words for mind, psycho, plus zoic, animal, thus presenting the Noosphere. And he said, in our geologic era, in the psychozoic era, the era of reason, a new geochemical factor of paramount importance appears. During the last 10 or 20,000 years, the geochemical influence of mankind, which has captured green living matter by means of agriculture, has become unusually intense and diverse. We see a surprising speed in the growth of mankind's geochemical work. We see a more and more pronounced influence of consciousness and collective human reason upon geochemical processes. Man has introduced into the planet's structure a new form of effect upon the exchange of atoms between living matter and inert matter. Formerly, organisms affected the history only of those atoms that were necessary for their respiration, nutrition, and proliferation. Man has widened this circle, exerting influence upon elements necessary for technology and for the creation of civilized forms of life. Man acts here not as Homo sapiens, but Homo sapiens faber. Homo sapiens, the name of the human species, means knowing man. Faber means to fabricate. So knowing man who fabricates. The unleashing of ideas like this by Vernadsky in this Paris period caused a major freak out amongst the thought police of the British Empire. Because that's what Bertrand Russell and H.G. Wells and their circles were. As you have heard from the reports from the other presentations, they were already in an uproar against the revolution of dynamics in physical chemistry since the end of the 19th century. Now, here came Vernadsky from the country of Russia, which was supposed to have been taken over and or destroyed in the conflagration of World War I, with powerful and true insights that would completely overthrow the doctrines of ecology and eugenics, i.e. the eugenics being the pseudoscience that says man is nothing but an animal. And this is what the British were pushing intensely in the wake of World War I. Now, in the second period of his work from 1924 until his death in 1945, Vernadsky developed his conceptions of the biosphere and of the Noösphere in ways that had both immediate practical application and profound implications to the future development of mankind. provoked by his discussions with Marie Curie about the uncompleted work of her husband, Pierre Curie, especially on symmetry and the dissimetry characterizing what Curie called a different state of space, he delved into the question of what could be the substrate, what could underlie the three-phase spaces of existence that he was studying. So Vernadsky, for the rest of his life, was investigating fundamental principles of the universe. He explored the ontological nature of space and time in their relationship with living and non-living processes. Ontological means having to do with that which exists, the question of how and why what exists, does exist. Vernadsky was very familiar with the work of Louis Pasteur on the left and right-handedness of molecules and crystals, which he brought into his own investigations of the nature of space and time. As we'll see, Vernadsky's ideas ran counter to what became the official ideology of the Soviet Union, called dialectical materialism. In fact, the attacks on Vernadsky within the Soviet Union for violating dialectical materialism were nothing but a subset of the overt and covert attacks on his ideas by the British outside the Soviet Union, since the Communist Party's materialist ideology descended directly from the influence of the Fabian Society's Friedrich Engels, in particular within Marxism. In his speeches and discussions during visits to post-Soviet Russia since the 1990s, Lyndon LaRouche has often emphasised Engels' Darwin-flavoured fixation on the human opposable thumb, the fact that humans can reach across the rest of their hand, rest of their hand and grab something as being the key to economic process, right? We've got opposable thumbs, and we can do that. This notion is a dead giveaway for how Marxist economics and dialectical materialism were spin-off from the same old tired British reductionist anti-human doctrines about how the world works. Vernadsky fought and polemicised against those attacks in the Soviet Union, but it is important to realise something else, something that is crucial to what a towering moral figure he is, which has everything to do with why he is such a great scientist. After the horrors of World War I, the British manipulated Russian Revolution of 1917 and the Civil War, remember, an absolute minimum of 8% of the whole population had just been wiped out, there was a situation in which educated Russians, the cream of the famous Russian intelligentsia, emigrated to the West in droves. The pressure on Vernadsky to leave his homeland was immense. He himself was arrested and interrogated in the summer of 1921. Later, during the manipulated purge trials and the mass executions in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, Vernadsky's life was in constant danger. He was accused of idealism at a time when people were routinely being shot or exiled to the labour camps in Siberia on the pretext of being for idealism and against dialectical materialism. Under those conditions, why did Vernadsky return to the USSR in 1926? Why did he not stay? Not only did Vernadsky not leave his country, he also continued making world historical breakthroughs in science and a critical contribution to the development of the economy of Russia and Ukraine, of the entire Soviet Union really, including things like the atom program, the Soviet nuclear program. He was key to the survival of the Russian Academy of Sciences, founded by Tsar Peter the Great under the guidance of Leibniz in the early 1700s, as a crucial institution in the Soviet Union. He also created the Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, and he ensured the survival of another key institution, which he himself had led under the Tsarist government during the war, the Council for the Study of Productive Forces, known by its Russian acronym KEPS, or the KEPS. Among other things, it is clear that the Soviet ruler, Joseph Stalin, protected Vernadsky, having an appreciation that his ideas and work were vital to the survival of that country. At the same time, it is fairly clear that Vernadsky believed that his work in Russia and Ukraine and the survival of their whole scientific tradition, not to mention their resources, was important for mankind. Thus, Vernadsky combines the qualities of a patriot, a world citizen, patriot and world citizen, world historical scientist. Lyndon LaRouche wrote about that in a 1996 article, Russia's Role in International History, Letter to a Russian Friend. There LaRouche said, as typified by the case of the great Vernadsky, the Bolsheviks adopted some of the tradition of the Russian intelligentsia's best statesmen and poets before them. They sought to erect a society in imitation of that modern nation-state form first established by France's Louis XI, a society echoing that design wrought by the founders of the US Federal Republic of 1789, premised upon universal citizenship with leading emphasis upon establishing a quality of universal education essential to a society increasing its productive powers of labour through investment in scientific and technological progress. The case of biogeochemist and nuclear scientist V.I. Vernadsky typifies the relevant point. No truly sentient observer could deny that in areas of physical science, including biology, Soviet Russia made durable contributions to mankind's history. Now LaRouche continued, referring to Vernadsky's sometimes life and death struggle, and he said, quote, like all societies emerging from prolonged dark ages, Russia stumbled into the modern world haltingly at first as a two-tier society. It came out of a habituated cultural tradition in which the institutions integrated with feudalism had worked to keep each section of the population in its assigned place. V.I. Vernadsky's political difficulties under Tsarism and also during significant parts of Soviet history typify this. He was not so much a dissident within the Soviet system as a dissident within all expressions of modern Russia's inherited cultural backwardness. He is typical, thus, of that moral quality which distinguishes a true creative scientific mentality. He hates that which crushes the creative potential of the individual human personality. Throughout the latter period, Vernadsky more and more elaborated the idea of the Noosphere, that mankind was becoming the most powerful geological force on the planet because of his unique powers of reason and creativity. Whilst his work was left unfinished in many areas, the concept of the Noosphere has been continued by Lyndon LaRouche. Think about Lynn's fight against the British and the Marxist economics, which say that wealth comes from one, the bounty of nature, or two, free trade, or three, the horny hand of labour with its opposable thumbs. LaRouche's physical economy demonstrates the source of human wealth is creativity. That is the Noosphere. This afternoon I'm going to give you a fair bit of detail about Vernadsky's beautiful discoveries to demonstrate that the universe does conform to Leibniz's idea of the principle of sufficient reason, and not to the boring idea of Newtonian space that is empty and operates on the basis of purely mechanical laws, directed by a creator who stands outside the universe with a big whip to keep it from running down. The principle of sufficient reason is something Vernadsky knew very well. He was always searching for the causes of new phenomena he had discovered. At one point of the discussions with Lisa in the preparations for these classes about Vernadsky, I complained that Max Planck, Einstein, Leibniz, Pasteur, they all seem to have no hesitation about talking about theological concepts such as God, while Vernadsky seemed never to mention God or any religious ideas at all. I wondered if he had the same understanding of this principle of sufficient reason as did Leibniz and those other scientists I mentioned before. Or was the problem that in Soviet Russia you could be killed for talking about God? Right? A postscript to his correspondence with a young geologist when he was 77 years of age gave me the answer. Vernadsky said, P.S. Now, I simply don't think in philosophical terms. When I proceed in science, spiritualism for me, verbally expressed, is clear unreality. I believe in that my scientific work I penetrate so much more deeply, non-verbally and unconsciously than do these philosophers and religious mystics in their verbal cogitations. It's like some musicians, Bach or Beethoven or Mozart or others, who penetrated to the depths non-verbally. Vernadsky, it should be noted, was exposed to great classical singing in the culture of Ukraine from an early age. His mother was a music teacher and sang in choruses. For him to express the principle of creativity in the way he did there, through the greatest classical music composers such as Bach, demonstrated that he understood the concept of principle of sufficient reason very well, as he embraced the idea personally in his scientific work. In a lecture fragment in the 1920s, titled The Principle of Symmetry in Science and Philosophy, Vernadsky also talked in musical terms about the essence of creative scientific thought. He said, "Any naturalist knows, or at least senses, that scientific and philosophical thought, so far, has only to a small degree brought the rules for the establishment of a scientific fact into a clear logical system. Beyond the bounds of logical formula lies an enormous domain of scientific creative work whose fundamental essence is manifested in the establishment of new scientific facts. We express this domain by pointing out the significance in the development of science, of intuition, of a scientific sense of cadence, of unconscious insight, and of a sense of measure and of beauty. These and many other diverse and hazy expressions correspond to one and the same phenomenon, the impossibility of fully expressing in logical and mathematical formulas the conditions of the establishment of a scientific fact or a scientific discovery. Each of us knows how incomplete and inadequate are all the logical and mathematical rules developed by scientific and philosophical work over many centuries, and how they only partially correspond to reality. Alongside these profound considerations concerning man and nature, as I was studying Vernadsky's life and discoveries, I was also struck by how this great scientist was so involved in the politics of his time. He was active in party politics, and more fundamentally always championed the idea that the real development of Russia would only come from the growth of the scientific, that is, the creative abilities of its citizenry. As I wasn't expecting that, because I too had been taking Lynn's constant references to Vernadsky too much for granted, it was a wonderful surprise. As one of the founders of the CEC 23 years ago, I discovered that there were many aspects of Vernadsky's life that I can relate to very personally. Vernadsky was born in 1863 in St. Petersburg. His father, Ivan, was a prominent intellectual and professor of political economy, author of the first economics textbook for Russia, and had started his economic career by winning a gold medal for his thesis in Platonic philosophy. His mother, as I mentioned, was a music teacher and a famous singer in a famous choir. Both were Ukrainian. Young Vernadsky was an avid reader and seeker after knowledge. Starting at just the age of 13 and over the course of his life, in order to understand original concepts in history, he taught himself over 15 different languages. While a teenager, Vernadsky read some of the most important books of the 19th century scientists, often in their original languages. In that way, he perfected his knowledge in foreign languages and familiarized himself with the most advanced scientific thought. Vernadsky also happens to have shared something with Marie Curie, whose biography you heard from Gabby, the death of a sibling at an early age. His older half-brother, Nikolai Vernadsky, died of TB when Vladimir was 11 years old. I mention this not as a so-called human interest story, but because Vladimir Vernadsky himself said that this experience was related to his consciousness of the workings of the human mind. He wrote later on about how his way of dealing with this terrible grief made a lifelong impact on his self-awareness of his own mental processes. As a child, he deliberately schooled himself not to have images of close relatives within his mind, because it was too painful for him to picture his beloved brother, whom he had looked up to and adored. According to associates of Vernadsky, towards the very end of his life, when he was taking the entirety of the universe into his mind, he was able to restore this imaging of other people. No doubt the effort of looking over his own shoulder into his own mental processes was an important one for his future development, for this future developer of the concept of the Noösphere, the superior realm of human cognition. As a part of his preparation to enter St. Petersburg University, Vernadsky decided to perfect his German by reading two of Alexander von Humboldt's works, The Cosmos and The Pictures of Nature. Humboldt, as you heard from Anne, was a leading intellectual figure of the early 19th century and a person who sustained a colossal capacity for intense and prolonged intellectual work over his lifetime. Vernadsky became a universal natural scientist in the sense of Humboldt and Humboldt's cosmos. At university, Vernadsky studied chemistry, crystallography, mineralogy and other natural sciences. He had the opportunity to study under some of the greatest scientists of his time, among them the great chemist and inventor of the periodic table, Dmitry Mendeleev, the chemist and pioneer of modern structural chemistry, Alexander Butlerov, and also the mineralogist Vasily Dokuchaev, regarded as the father of pedology, or the study of soils in their natural setting. Dokuchaev developed soil science in Russia and was perhaps the first person to make wide geological investigations of different soil types. His great contributions to science was literally to put soils on the map. Dokuchaev was Vernadsky's university mentor for many years, and given my background of developing poor soils in Hervey Bay region before establishing the CEC, this is another area of real interest. Remember, Vernadsky was growing up and receiving his education during the worldwide scientific and industrial upsurge after the American Civil War, in which upsurge Russia was closely involved because of Tsar Alexander II's alliance with Lincoln, and because of the role of Mendeleev as a universal scientific mind, and, together with Count Sergei Witte, a proponent of the American system and vehement foe of British free trade looting doctrines. The serfs had been emancipated in 1861, but with burdensome conditionalities. There was a continuing backlash against Tsar Alexander's reforms from Russia's landed aristocracy, and they ultimately assassinated him in 1881. An aristocracy that was constituted out of the big families who also were historically intertwined with the British interests that were fundamentally hostile to Russia's development as an industrial nation. All the work on soil science by Dokuchaev and by Mendeleev himself was related to the burning political question of what Russia's agricultural production was going to look like. Indeed, one of Mendeleev's major goals on his trip to America for the 1876 Philadelphia exhibition had been to gather knowledge about American research and experimentation on soils. Reflecting on his student days under Dokuchaev, Vernadsky recalled in 1935, while reading mineralogy at the University of St. Petersburg, I began on a path at the time unaccustomed. That was in connection with the work and the contact during my student years and immediately afterwards, from 1883 to 97, with the great Russian scientist V.V. Dokuchaev. He first turned my attention to the dynamic side of mineralogy, the study of minerals through time. This defined the whole course of my teaching and my study of mineralogy and was reflected in my thought and scientific work and the scientific work of students and colleagues. So this concept of looking at geological processes through time was a crucial beginning for Vernadsky's work. as most geology at that time was only concerned with categorizing minerals. Vernadsky participated in many geological field trips under Dokuchaev, for example to the Poltava region in Ukraine, where you have some of the richest soils on the planet, with the famous Black Earth Belt. A LaRouche movement delegation to Ukraine in 2009 saw the hotel where Dokuchaev and Vernadsky stayed during their research visit to Kremenchug, Poltava region in the 1880s and 1890s, one of the few buildings in the city that survived the Nazi invasion during World War II. Vernadsky was interested in more than just documenting the types of minerals they found. He always questioned the genesis of the minerals. In 1886, whilst completing his studies at university, he married Natasha Staritskaya, a marriage that lasted until her death in 1943, over 56 years. Through this long marriage, we've come to understand a lot about Vernadsky's thought, as he wrote frequently to his wife when staying away for long periods of time. After completing his studies in 1888, Vernadsky made his first of many travels to France, Germany and other European countries, establishing a host of intellectual contacts. As I mentioned before, Vernadsky was an intensely political person devoted to universal education and to the scientific progress of Russia, Ukraine and all nations. He was involved in the political ferment at the turn of the 20th century and became a leading figure in the Constitutional Democratic Party. Vernadsky served on the Russian State Council from 1906 to 1911, when Peter Stolypin was Prime Minister, and for a brief time between the February and October revolutions of 1917. He was at the time an Assistant Minister of Education in charge of all universities. Earlier in the 1890s, he'd been involved in local government in the Tambrov region, where he had actually inherited a 1,450-acre family property and taken a lead in organising famine relief during one of the deepest food crises in 19th century Russia. Vernadsky worked on issues of educating the rural population and developing the country's intellectual culture. Writing to his wife in 1893, "I am deeply convinced and become ever more convinced that the sole possibility of making culture durable is to raise the level of the masses, to make culture a necessity for them." In 1894, again writing to Natalia, "Woe to that country where knowledge is poorly developed, where it has barely penetrated the working masses." So he was very passionate about this particular idea of education. In 1906, Vernadsky's inquiries into the role of life on our planet, the impact of life on non-living or inert things such as the rocks he looked at in mineralogy, began to come into focus in an explicit way. Those inquiries were rooted in his study of soils with Dokuchaev. Writing in his diary in September 1906, Vernadsky sets forth this question: what significance has the entire organic world taken as a whole in the general scheme of chemical reactions of the Earth? Has the character of its influence changed in the course of all geological history? And in what directions? Vernadsky wondered whether organisms invariably played a role in all geochemical cycles and asked himself what that role was. In 1908, he wrote to his son George Vernadsky, who was studying history at Moscow University, and he said, "My thought is occupied with a new area which I am embracing, about the quantity of living matter and the interrelationship between living and inert matter. With some awe and lack of understanding, I am all the same entering this new era, since it seems that I see some sides of a problem which until now no one has seen. I am succeeding here in approaching new phenomena." So 1906 was a turning point at which Vernadsky turned his geologist's mind, trained to think in terms of masses, strata and formulations of matter, onto biological phenomena. He began to think about all life almost as if it were a geological stratum formed from what he called living matter, a type of matter that was highly chemically active and different in many respects from non-living matter. From non-living matter. Later on, he would term the layer occupied by such matter not exactly a stratum, but an envelope of the Earth, the biosphere. Here was the beginnings of the ideas which, 15 to 20 years later, Vernadsky would pose dramatically in his Sorbonne lectures and in his book, The Biosphere. In those works, Vernadsky asked how much living matter exists as a whole, and what is its role in the cycle of various chemical elements. He developed a rigorous scientific framework within which to characterize the biosphere. He used the concept natural bodies, saying that it is possible to distinguish between three types of natural bodies within the biosphere. Living bodies, for example, a plant, a beetle, a cow, etc. Inert bodies, for example, rock, quartz, etc., and bio-inert bodies, such as a soil, lake water, rocks, and so forth. The biosphere consists of sharply bounded domains formed by living, inert, and bio-inert bodies, waters, living matter, rocks, air, and so forth. The new concept of a bio-inert body was developed by Vernadsky to describe bodies that are characteristic of the biosphere. They are structures consisting of inert and living bodies simultaneously, for example, soils or lake water, including matter that is now inert but was created, shaped, or put there where it is by living processes. Such zones cannot simply be treated as inert matter, as their physical and chemical properties are determined by living and inert processes. In defining the biosphere, rather than get preoccupied in philosophical or religious discussions about nature and debate on life, Vernadsky posed the question, what does life do? He was one of the first scientists to ask what role living matter plays in geochemical cycles and how living matter and inert matter differ. From the outset of his development of the biosphere concept, Vernadsky was exploring not merely rocks on Earth, but the cosmic origin of the Earth and its characteristic features, especially the biosphere. The very first paragraph of his book, The Biosphere, outlines how he thought about this. The face of the Earth, viewed from celestial space, presents a unique appearance, different from all other heavenly bodies. The surface that separates the planet from the cosmic medium is the biosphere. Visible principally because of the light from the sun, although it receives an infinite number of other radiations from space, of which only a small fraction are visible to us. We hardly realise the variety and importance of these rays, which cover a huge range of wavelengths. Heard this somewhere before? Our understanding is full of gaps, but improved detectors are rapidly expanding our knowledge of their existence and variety. Certainly they make the empty cosmic regions different from the ideal space of geometry. Our Earth is intimately tied to the farthest reaches of the cosmos by virtue of the radiations that come from those far out regions. And our biosphere has developed from those radiations. The biosphere may be regarded as the region of transformers that convert cosmic radiations into active energy, into electrical, chemical, mechanical, thermal, and other forms. Radiations from distant stars enter the biosphere, but we catch and perceive only an insignificant part of the total. This comes almost exclusively from the sun, and of that we only receive 1/2 billionth of the total solar output. The existence of radiation, Vernadsky says, originating in the most distant regions of the cosmos cannot be doubted. Stars and nebulae are constantly emitting specific radiations, and everything suggests that the penetrating radiations discovered in the upper regions of the atmosphere originates beyond the limits of the solar system, perhaps beyond the limits of the Milky Way, in nebulae or in stars of a certain variable type. As Vernadsky then states, it is living matter, the Earth's sum total of living organisms, that transforms the radiant energy of the sun into active chemical energy of the biosphere. living matter creates innumerable new chemical compounds by photosynthesis and extends the biosphere at incredible speed as a thick layer of new molecular systems. Vernadsky went on to document the activity of life, that is, living organisms, including the activity of microorganisms like bacteria, that of plants through photosynthesis, and then the activity of higher forms of animals. All have acted for millions, if not billions of years to transform the biosphere. Living organisms absorb and digest material, both living material and inert material, and solar radiation from the surrounding environment, integrate those transformed substances into their own bodies and excrete material outside. When that organism dies, the organic material is deposited again in the environment, often in a changed location, with different combinations and concentrations of chemical elements. What we see with all living organisms is what Vernadsky calls the biogenic migration of atoms, the transfer of inert material and energy into a living body where it is transformed and functions for a period of time and then is excreted or left behind as a different product. The rate at which this happens within the biosphere is called biogenic flux. The vast deposits of minerals on the Earth today, but also the chemical composition of the Earth's atmosphere, its oceans, its soils, and the surface formation down to considerable depth resulted from living processes. As Vernadsky concluded, the biosphere, including its present system of weather and climate, is thus a natural product of the processes of living matter or the principle of life. The long term of upward biological evolution towards more and more complex organisms, as outlined in Vernadsky's work, proves the Newtonian mechanistic entropic universe to be a complete fraud. In the Leibniz-Clark correspondence, you would have noted that Leibniz, in his very first letter, outlined the fraud of the first and second laws of dynamics, as I went through yesterday. To refresh your memory again, Leibniz says of Newton that Sir Isaac Newton and his followers have also a very odd opinion concerning the work of God. According to their doctrine, God Almighty wants, i.e. needs, to wind up his watch from time to time, otherwise it would cease to move. The principle of life, which is the sufficient reason governing our biosphere, manifested in the totality of living matter, defies the second law of thermodynamics. That is, the insistence that there must be increasing disorder of the system from a loss of overall energy. Vernadsky himself states this explicitly in his essays on geochemistry in a passage on what he calls the growth of active geological energy and the complete change of the biosphere occurring within the development of new species, where he says, Clausius's entropy does not really exist. It is not a fact of being, but a mathematical expression, useful and necessary when it allows the expression of natural phenomena in mathematical language, the deviation from so-called laws of entropy, by such an essential phenomenon as living matter and its influence upon the biosphere, shows that life does not stay within the premises for which entropy is stated. When looking at the vast expanse of biological evolution, what we see is that the total aggregate of free energy of living matter in the biosphere, a measure of its power to do work in transforming the environment, has been constantly increasing, starting with that tiny small molecule chlorophyll. And as Vernadsky says, all living matter can be regarded as a single entity in the mechanism of the biosphere, but only one part of life, green vegetation, the carrier of chlorophyll, makes direct use of solar radiation. Through photosynthesis, chlorophyll makes use of solar radiation. Through photosynthesis, chlorophyll produces chemical compounds that, following the death of the organism of which they are a part, are unstable in the biosphere's thermodynamic field. The whole living world is connected to this green part of life by a direct and unbreakable link. The matter of animals and plants that do not contain chlorophyll has developed from chemical compounds produced by green life. Animals and fungi accumulate nitrogen-rich substances which, as centers of chemical free energy, become even more powerful agents of change. Their energy is also released through decomposition when, after death, they leave the thermodynamic field in which they are stable, that is inside their bodies, and enter the thermodynamic field of the biosphere. Living matter as a whole, the totality of living organisms, is therefore a unique system which accumulates chemical free energy in the biosphere by the transformation of solar radiation. And now I'd like to turn and give you a presentation, watch a small section of a video that was put out by the basement that spells this out in very clear terms. So.
People who say that space is empty are more likely speaking about the inside of their own heads than our universe. Despite what most of us believe about the world we live in, our Earth is not sitting out there in an empty ocean of space. We are, as academician V.I. Vernadsky foretold decades ago, situated in a cosmic medium, a medium filled with cosmic radiation. When we think about the future of mankind, we come face to face with the problem of cosmic radiation in the mission to land a man on Mars and colonize space. As things stand right now, we're confronted with the harsh reality that whoever we would send to Mars would not have the proper simulated Earth gravitational environment in a space capsule, and therefore wouldn't make it to the planet or back home, at least in any form that's recognizably human, because our astronauts will be traveling through cosmic radiation and other phenomena without the protection of the Earth's electromagnetic field, gravity, and other things in our environment on Earth that keep us alive. So one of the primary challenges before us is creating synthetic environments to transport us to other planets and for developing the habitat of other planets. This mission will force us to think about the immediate challenge of the kind of needed buildup of infrastructure here on Earth in a much more developed, systematic way, as the challenge of creating synthetic environments suitable for our growth and existence is not a local challenge, but a planetary one. That is what we must come to understand as infrastructure. Now, don't make the mistake of thinking that mankind is the only species that looks at things in this way. It's clear from the history of Earth's biosphere that we have a common friend in the green plant, who, by aid of photosynthesis, has created its own synthetic environment to sustain life. Looking at the development of our oxygen-rich atmosphere may give us some insight into the real nature of infrastructure. The atmosphere of the young primordial Earth would have been very unpleasant for many of the life forms we have today. At one of the earliest periods in the Earth's history, we can recall the atmosphere of Earth consisting mainly of carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, and water, although other compounds existed. The earliest Earth atmosphere consisted mostly of the mixture of gases that are familiar to us from volcanic activity. Although this created some rough environmental conditions, life emerged and began to develop as soon as it possibly could. The earliest life forms were single-celled prokaryotic organisms that contained everything they needed within that one cell. They had a simple internal structure and got their nutrition directly from their environment. Soon, in the course of geological time, perhaps even as long ago as 3.5 billion years ago, organisms developed that were able to obtain its energy directly from the sun, with aid of water and carbon dioxide, the phototrophs. These organisms were probably the evolutionary precursors of what we know now as the chloroplast, an organelle found in eukaryotes. This new way of obtaining energy from the sun produced oxygen gas as its byproduct. As the oxygen accumulated in the atmosphere, some of this oxygen was converted to ozone as a result of the ultraviolet radiation coming from the sun. This layer of ozone created a protective layer over the crust of the Earth, allowing for the evolution of land creatures and other plant life, giving green plants the protection and free rein to flourish and dominate in creating the oxygen-rich atmosphere we breathe and enjoy today through the process found in green plants called photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process in green plants that transforms carbon dioxide and water into free oxygen and carbohydrates. The chlorophyll found in the ocean and in plants is key in this process. It's found in the chloroplasts of green plants, and it's what makes green plants green. In the oceans, this occurs through the phytoplankton. The phytoplankton are the tiny single-celled plants that live in the ocean, and they serve as the base of the oceanic food chain. In both cases, in plants and in the ocean, the chlorophyll molecule absorbs sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide. Luckily for these plants, carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere by a number of sources, including volcanic eruptions, hot mineral sources, natural gases, and by weathering of igneous rocks, from solutions in seas and fresh water to the respiration of plants and animals during their life, through processes related to their decomposition or decay after death, and also through soils. Carbon dioxide is quite literally the lifeblood of living processes. From this abundance of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the sunlight absorbed, the chlorophyll chooses the elements it wants for food and energy, turns them into carbohydrates and tasty sugars for its own nourishment and satisfaction, and releases the oxygen from the water as the waste it doesn't need, creating the conditions for the oxygen-rich atmosphere that we have today. This process has created the environment, the infrastructure for life to exist in increasing numbers, and has become known today as the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle has not only provided Earth with free oxygen, but has been a primary factor in facilitating the creation of an entire sphere of living activity, the synthetic environment we call the biosphere, through green plants' conversion of cosmic radiation. This synthetic environment, the biosphere, has changed the entire chemical and biological system of the organization of Earth. It has become a vector through which non-living materials travel through and are transformed, in fact. This is what we really mean by synthetic. We don't mean artificial. We mean materials brought together, synthesized, through a fundamental transformation in order to serve a purpose in life that they would otherwise not serve in the domain of non-life, just like carbon dioxide. This transformative power expressed by photosynthesis in plants is expressed in life generally, in life's ability to incorporate cosmic radiation and non-living materials found in the lithosphere into functional material for the development and expansion of all life, and represents an expression of the upward evolution of the Earth. Suddenly, we're forced to realize that the idea of a carbon cycle is very misleading, and in fact, it's a complete fallacy to say that the carbon cycle is merely a cycle at all. And if we're really going to understand the importance of life's role in creating the infrastructure for further life and its effects, we have to re-examine the assumption built into the idea of the monotonous cycle, the second law of thermodynamics.
Thermodynamics. All right, let's start. Thermodynamics is the science of the flow of heat.
Okay. A couple of things to notice. One is, in some sense, the second law is kind of negative, right? Must not have been done in the New Age. It tells us what we can't do. Right? And that really is, in a sense, what it's all about. It's telling us what are limitations of what can be accomplished. Okay. Very important part of this statement. In a cycle.
The typical idea of any cycle in today's universities and academic institutions corresponds to the second law of thermodynamics. That is, for any closed system or cycle which involves an exertion of work, the quantity of free energy capable of doing work is drawn down. As the process winds down, the free energy available will run out, and the process ends in the heat death of that particular system. In fact, it has become generally accepted that any process that uses energy to do some kind of work, which is practically everything, will reach this heat death, leading to the idea that the universe has a fixed amount of free energy capable of doing work, and which, once used and dispersed as heat, could not be recovered. According to this, one day the universe itself will at some point cease to be capable of work, because the fixed amount of free energy capable of doing the work in the universe will be all converted into unusable heat energy, leading to an inevitable irreversible entropy, the heat death of the universe. Unfortunately, for those who happen to be firm believers in the religion of the second law doesn't even apply to plant life and the carbon cycle produced by it, let alone the entire universe. In his essays on geochemistry, academician Vladimir Vernadsky showed that photosynthesis in plants is one phenomena that not only absorbs and uses free energy, but creates it. In this case, the free energy consumed is cosmic radiation, sunlight, and the carbon dioxide that is naturally let out into the atmosphere by volcanoes, natural gases, water vapor, and other phenomena. The photosynthesis, which occurs in chlorophyll, separates the oxygen from those elements, then chooses the carbon dioxide and combines it with hydrogen from water to create carbohydrates and other compounds for its food while releasing its waste, the free oxygen, into the atmosphere, an action which cannot even be accomplished through the sun's solar rays. The chlorophyll which does this acts as a technology of sorts, similar to human technologies like nuclear power plants, which do the work of nuclear fission. The plants use the relatively low-energy dense solar power as fuel. Think of solar power along with carbon dioxide and water as its natural resources. Somehow, the chlorophyll is able to accomplish work that solar energy can't in separating out the oxygen during photosynthesis. It's apparent that a higher form of energy flux density power is applied, and unlike solar power, has the ability to separate compounds that are bounded in this particular way. What we end up with is a new transformative power represented by green plants and life on this planet, with the ability to expand its own activities and transform the activities of the lithosphere through creating a synthetic environment, infrastructure to push forward its rapid development, expressing an anti-entropic effect on the entire planet. What are the effects of this? Vernadsky says,
living matter increases the active energy of the Earth's crust in two ways. First, by releasing gases, and second, as a consequence, creating the terrestrial atmosphere, as its dominant gases such as nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide are biogenic. Due to the fact of these organisms' existence, the quantity of free energy capable of doing work evidently increases toward the end of their life in the surrounding nature, and eventually in the course of geological time. The free oxygen produced by green plants, the coal forming from their remains, the organic compounds of their bodies which nurture animals, and the movement and the chemical and physical manifestations present new kinds of energy activities that are by no means accompanied by the degradation of the initial solar energy. This energy has passed to form, creating an organism that possesses potential immortality and which increases and does not decrease the active energy of the initial solar rays. Due to the existence of life, the entropy of the universe should decrease in biospheric phenomena and not increase.
Due to the existence of life, the entropy of the universe should decrease. The disorder should decrease in biospheric phenomena and not increase. That is, life in the biosphere causes higher and higher potential states of organisation. There is no Newtonian clock that winds down. With this free energy to do work within the biosphere, that is the overall increase in power, living matter has become the most powerful geological force, and this is an extremely important idea. The total mass of living matter is far less than the mass of non-living matter in the biosphere. No greater than 0.1% of the biosphere by weight, something like 0.25% in total. This tiny portion of the whole biosphere has a power far exceeding its physical weight. Think ahead to the Noösphere. Just as the quantitatively smaller living matter within the biosphere governs the non-living matter, we then have the Noosphere, the power of human cognition, which is greater. In that case, you can't even weigh it at all. What is the weight or the mass of a thought? And yet mind exerts power over the biosphere and the lithosphere. The relative size and the relative power of the three phase spaces is neatly summed up in another video, just as a very brief clip, prepared last month by The Basement for an audience in Ukraine.
Vernadsky takes Riemann's ideas to an even higher level in establishing a universe capable of containing within itself the three distinct phase spaces of the abiotic, the biotic, and the cognitive. With respect to the interaction of these three phase spaces, Vernadsky shows that life is an organizing force for the non-living. Despite the fact that it is a relatively weak force, the slow activity of life over millennia has a greater geological effect than any ostensibly abiotic phenomenon. That is, although a single bacterium would probably lose in any immediate conflict with a mountain, it is yet the bacteria which have had the more significant, lasting effect upon mountains. In the same way, although a single unarmed average human probably wouldn't survive a conflict with a large bear, it is yet the humans and not the bears which have the potential to organize all life on the planet, shaping forests and landscapes, while training bears to ice skate. All of this culminates in Lyndon LaRouche's concept of physical economy, the science of how mankind organizes the universe as co-creators. This includes our present work on the history of the development of Earth's biosphere and its relationship to cosmic processes. This development is to be understood, in the way Vernadsky understood it, as the process which mankind must revolutionize with its own economic activity, subsuming the biosphere in all of its cosmic extent within the Noösphere.
Now look, a majority of the matter in the biosphere within the Earth's crust and the oceans is a product of life over billions of years of constant interaction between living processes and cosmic radiation, mainly the sun. The Earth's crust, its oceans, the atmosphere are products of the biogenic migration of atoms from the inert part of the biosphere into living bodies and then being exhaled or excreted or left as small fossils. Classic example is an example of the chalk of the White Cliffs of Dover. This is from living processes, or iron ore deposits in the Hamersley Iron Range up there, right? They're non-living now, but they are a product of life. This tiny fraction of living matter has always been relatively tiny throughout geological time, and it's a directed evolutionary development, creating increasing amounts of free energy, and it is unique to living processes. It's not found in the non-living domain or the inert domain. This difference creates an absolute material energetic distinction between living and non-living processes. Throughout the geological history of the Earth, the processes of non-living or inert matter in the biosphere have remained the same for billions of years, except when being acted on by living matter. Under the actions of living processes, that is through the unique property of the manipulation of living matter, the envelope of the Earth that is populated by living organisms, the biosphere, it has been constantly expanding, extending upwards into the atmosphere and into the depths of the oceans and even deeper into the Earth's crust, about 3 kilometres. That process of expansion of the biosphere occurs through the colonisation of new regions, formerly not inhabited by living organisms, in the course of which more of the non-living matter and the energy of the Earth's crust and atmosphere is transformed and caught up into the biogeochemical cycles connected with the metabolic and related activity of living organisms, what Vernadsky called the biogenic flux of matter and energy in the biosphere. But Vernadsky states that life covers land in almost an uninterrupted film. roughly extending some tens of metres above the surface of forested areas. The physical geography of the land areas can determine the type of life that are possible, but there are no permanently sterile areas anywhere on the surface of the Earth. When considering water bodies, oceans, lakes, rivers, underground water, Vernadsky used the term living concentrations when referring to living matter within those aqueous bodies, because they are quite distinct biochemically and biologically and are different in their geological effect. Nonetheless, life in these bodies always displays motion, the same as life on land. In his work on the biosphere, Vernadsky sought to quantify certain aspects of the behaviour of living processes. One of these delightful concepts is the speed of transmission and multiplication of life. He says that extensive films formed by bacteria are constantly observed in the biosphere, and there is enormous biochemical energy associated with these forms of life. To give you a sense of the power of the biochemical energy involved and the potential for life to utilise it, he stated, if the temperature of the universal sea had been favourable and there had been no obstacles to multiplication, spherical bacteria, each 10 to the minus 12 cubic centimetres in size, would have formed a continuous skin over the Earth's approximately 51 million square kilometres in less than 36 hours. So from the discussion above, we have an idea of the upward evolutionary development leading to the continual increase in the free energy of living processes in the biosphere. And it's unique to living processes and represents a fundamental material energetic break with the domain of the non-living. So at the end, that's what Vernadsky basically concluded his first part of up to the biosphere. And Vernadsky left a wonderful summary of the principle of life that caused the editors of the 1999 English edition of his book to write extensive footnotes to try and hose down what he'd laid out in his non-reductionist method. He said, the appearance and the formation of living matter on our planet is clearly a phenomenon of cosmic character. It is also very clear that living matter becomes manifest without abiogenesis, that is, life coming from non-life. In other words, living organisms have always sprung from living organisms during the whole of geological history. They're all genetically connected, and nowhere can solar radiation be converted into chemical energy independent of prior living organisms. Let's move into a slightly different area which has been renowned for. What Vernadsky captured in his book, The Biosphere, which I mentioned came out in Russia in 1926 and in French in 1929, was a detailed record of his research up until that point. The work Vernadsky did over the rest of his life, from what most people consider the age of retirement of 65 until his death in 1945 at the age of 82, represented his most profound contributions to science. Pursuing his creative breakthroughs under the pressure of the devastating political surges in the Soviet Union of the 1930s and then during World War II, and all the time continuing to provide crucial leadership within the Soviet Academy of Sciences and various urgent national programs, Vernadsky only opened the book, so to speak, on some of the major questions he grappled with, and he died before he could settle a number of the questions that he raised. This period started when he met and worked with Marie Curie in France in 1924. The key area of Vernadsky's scientific investigation was investigating the structure of real physical space and time. These were burning issues for all scientists in the areas of Einstein's breakthroughs and Planck's work, as we've seen. Vernadsky believed that here the key would be found to that question about the qualitative distinction of life, of living matter, which had captured his attention in his studies of geochemistry and the biosphere. When Vernadsky met and worked with Marie Curie, she was able to elaborate for him the nature of Pierre Curie's final incomplete work. Vernadsky recorded in an unfinished late work that she thinks that this notion of the states of space contained the synthesis of his, that is Pierre's, thought. She reported to Vernadsky that Pierre Curie had challenged the reductionist view of empty space, putting forward the idea that there is a real structure to space which may not be everywhere the same. Throughout the rest of his life, Vernadsky credited the notion of the state of space to Pierre Curie. In draft lecture fragments from the 1920 to 27 period discussing, quote, the principle of symmetry, Vernadsky said about Pierre, "The principle of symmetry has encompassed and is encompassing ever more new domains in the 20th century. From the domain of matter, it penetrated into the domain of energy. From the domain of crystallography and the solid state physics, it entered the domain of chemistry, the domain of molecular processes, and the physics of the atom. There is no doubt that we shall find its manifestations in the world of the electron, which is even more remote from the complexes surrounding us, and that quantum phenomena will be subordinated to it. Undoubtedly, phenomenon of life and the universal cosmos are encompassed by it." More than 40 years ago, Pierre Curie, in his unfinished work that was interrupted by his death and by the discovery of radium, was the first to point out that the principle of symmetry is fundamental for all physical phenomena. It is just as necessary for understanding them as extension is. In other words, it has the same significance for physical science as dimension does for geometric space. Symmetry defines or determines the physical state of space. I must pause here to emphasize the often forgotten significance of the individual. The untimely death of Curie at the height of his powers brought to a halt the work of thought in this area for decades. Curie grasped the significance of symmetry in physical phenomena when people were unaware of a connection between symmetry and the facts of physics. He pointed it out where others didn't see it. After 1906, the year of Curie's death, there opened up before us an enormous new domain of facts regulated by symmetry. But there was no mind around which would have pointed out or even wanted to point out the general significance of this phenomenon and would have drawn from those facts the inevitable scientific and then philosophical conclusions. It would have been otherwise had Curie been alive in those years, because the new facts were a brilliant confirmation of his vision. In the scientific domain, thanks to Curie, it would have been expected and anticipated that the principle of symmetry would enter into the explanation of what was happening. Now, what Pierre Curie had been developing as an idea of fundamentally different states of space was directly related to the difference between inert processes and living ones already discovered by Louis Pasteur in the form of chirality and handedness, which you went through yesterday. Following Curie, Vernadsky proposed that the differences between living and inert bodies with respect to their symmetry and chirality could happen because the space they occupied was in different states. Both Pierre Curie and Vernadsky saw this notion as the states of space as a fundamental principle. And Vernadsky writes, "Symmetry is not an abstract notion that is deductively derived, as scientists often think. It is the result of an empirical generalization that has been worked out first unconsciously over centuries. Symmetry characterizes the different states of space of the natural bodies and the phenomenon of our planet. Therefore, the examination of the different properties of symmetries is an examination of the different states of space." Now, Pasteur had already discovered the dissymmetry in the crystals of tartaric acid as a result of the actions of living processes. Nolan went through this yesterday, but to recap, in 1848, Louis Pasteur succeeded in separating the right-handed and left-handed forms of tartaric acid crystals. He then dissolved them in water and examined the two solutions through a polariscope, which you saw yesterday. He found that one solution turned the plane of polarized light to the left, which was the left, and the other to the right. He then collected the crystals of tartaric acid that remained after the process of fermentation with yeasts. And he was able to show that only the left-handed crystals were left after that process took place, whereas while the type of tartaric acid that was synthesized in the laboratory had equal quantities of left and right-handed forms, that the racemic acid, right? And the racemic acid did not shift the polarized light. What is very important here to understand is that the left and right-handed crystals are impossible to differentiate chemically. as Noel went through. If you look at the two solutions of tartaric acid, one with the left-handed form and the other with the right-handed form, and they ran every possible chemical test imaginable, they were both the same. The yeast, a living organism, appeared to have rejected the right-handed form of tartaric acid and only utilised the left-handed form. Thus, we observed the dissimetry arising from the action of the living yeast. Only one of the two possible forms of crystals is present. Laboratory-made tartaric acid, however, which does not involve living matter, has the equal quantities of the left and right-handed tartaric acid crystals. A state of affairs that shows a characteristic symmetry. You have the two, and it's characteristic symmetry of inert chemical processes. This dissymmetry of organic products is typical of protoplasm and within all kinds of living matter. And it was explored. The fundamental property of dissymmetry in living processes was confirmed by a young Russian biologist, Georgy Gausser, who was part of Vernadsky's school at that time. Gausser survived various political and scientific attacks on his works by making a career move into the military, where his abilities were in demand. Gausser was working with a strain of Bacillus brevis, type of bacteria, and he noticed that it inhibited the growth of Staphylococcus aureus, or golden staph, when the two were mixed in a culture together. The Staph aureus is a very nasty bug that's common in hospital infections these days. But the Bacillus brevis produced a metabite, like a short string of amino acids, which was isolated by Gausser, within which he determined that just one of the amino acids, phenylalanine, was not the left-handed form, but the right-handed form. And this turned out to be the antibiotic called Gramicidinus S, as it had the effect of weakening the cell walls of the Staph aureus and destroying it. That's a metabolite. When Gausser switched the amino acid back to the other-handed form, that one molecule of amino acid, it had no effect on the Staph aureus. Now, there's many other substances that, when they enter living bodies, exhibit different characteristics depending on the handedness of the molecule. For example, aspartame, which is known as an artificial sweetener, it's one form. The right-handed form is actually bitter. If you look at caraway seeds, that's the left-handed form. The right-handed form gives us spearmint. Limonene, which is the compounds that gives us lemons and citrus, and that unique flavour with citrus. The right-handed form gives us a turpentoid, which smells like turpentine. Then you've got other various drugs, right? For example, and we make use of this in medicine, different drugs with different forms of the handed chemicals. You've got a chemical for the name called Darvone, for example, which is very good as an opiate painkiller, but if you change the handedness of one of the molecules, it'll just cure your cough. So you have this particular potential for handedness, particularly within living organisms. In all living organisms, proteins, which make up large molecules, which are the large molecules made up of smaller amino acid molecules, only use left-handed amino acids, whereas DNA and RNA, the so-called genetic material inside cells, contains only right-handed sugars, especially the right-handed sugar form called ribose. Now, it's important to grasp here the pattern. In non-living processes, the left and right-handed forms of a given compound behave identically and appear in roughly the same equal numbers. In living processes, they differ in their chemical behaviour and effects, and sometimes are found in different proportions with great preponderance of one of the forms, as we just noted. Now, further exploring questions of symmetry and dissimetry as they occur in non-living and living matter, Vernadsky wrote about questions of geometry that go back to the Pythagoreans and Plato. You most probably are familiar with some of them. If you've ever done a pedagogical exercise on constructing those Platonic solids, for example, over there, the first question you have to ask yourself is, which regular polyhedra can be constructed, first of all, and you can investigate which types of faces of those polyhedra, like how many of those particular types of polyhedra can you construct with all regular faces on them. you can investigate which types of faces they are made up of if you lay them flat on a plane. And you'll notice there's only a certain number of them that you can investigate the types of faces of those polyhedra. If you lay them flat on a plane, can they meet together around a shared vertex point with no gaps? And you can find out which ones can and which ones can't. You can look at which regular polyhedra can be close packed, that is packed together with no gaps, and which cannot. Or take the dodecahedron, a platonic solid with 12 pentagonal faces. It can't be close packed. You notice that the pentagons there can't be close packed. The dodecahedron forms do not occur in non-living crystals, but they only appear in the living world. Vernadsky pointed out that in the living world one can see 5, 7, 8, 9-fold symmetries of axes of symmetry, such are not found in crystals. You can see here 5-fold, 7-fold, 8-fold, 9-fold and 12-fold. You'll never see that in crystals, only in living processes. And that's an opium poppy on the end, the 12-fold. In Vernadsky's crucial 1938 essay, Problems of Biochemistry 2, on the fundamental material energetic distinctions between living and inert bodies in the biosphere, which appeared in English in the 21st Century Science and Technology in winter 2000-2001 issue, you can see a table he drew up showing the other properties that are characteristic of living matter: dispersiveness, stability, curvilinearity. Dispersiveness manifests in the sharp separateness of the living organism from the environment. An organism is a body sharply separated from its environment. That's what it is. Stability refers to the constancy of the form in which the living being exists. For example, birds have always had 2 wings. They don't all of a sudden grow an extra one. Stable forms of organisms have been observed for hundreds of millions of years. This is not the case with inert structures or processes of inert matter. You can have things such as erosion. Then you've got curvilinearity. A living organism is always separated from its environment by curved surfaces. The idea can be amplified by the idea that in mechanical, inert, non-living structures, curvature is only found in flexible structures as a result of bending. By contrast, living natural bodies have not been bent into their particular curvature, they have grown into it. Vernadsky posed that these differences are intrinsic to the space in which these bodies exist. Looking at the identical chemical properties and equal distribution of left and right-handed crystals of non-living matter, Vernadsky wrote, and I quote, "It follows that the identity of left-handedness and right-handedness is a geometrical property of the three-dimensional Euclidean space." That is, he said that the symmetry exhibited in non-living matter, wherein both the handed forms occur in equal numbers and behave identically, could be accounted for in this type of Euclidean space through symmetrical constructions using lines and points. Within living matter, however, you have something completely different, Vernadsky concluded. The absence, he said, of the equivalence of the manifestation of the right-handedness and the left-handedness, and the pronounced manifestation of left-handedness in material substrate of living matter and of right-handedness in its functions, i.e. DNA and so forth, indicate that the space occupied by living matter may not correspond to Euclidean geometry. Vernadsky pursued the question of whether the sharp distinction between the characteristics of the behaviour of living and non-living bodies meant that they occupied different states of space. He rejected the idea that living bodies could be regarded as existing in Euclidean space. Indeed, in draft essays and public speeches, Vernadsky said the same thing about empty three-dimensional Euclidean space as he said about Clausius's entropy. It simply doesn't exist. In his 1931 lecture to the Academy of Sciences on the problems of time in contemporary science, Vernadsky emphasised, "The space of the geometry of Newton's time invariably is isotropic, That is, time is the same in all directions and is homogeneous. There's no change. It corresponds to an absolute void. Such an absolute space, the space of ancient three-dimensional geometry, Euclidean, empty, homogeneous and isotropic, is not encountered in reality by the investigator of nature. And from a 1927 written fragment titled At the Frontier of Science, the Space of Natural Sciences and the Space of Philosophy and Mathematics, he said, one of the most fundamental distinctions in our thinking, that of naturalists on the one hand and of the mathematicians on the other, is the character of space. For the mathematician, unless he specifies differently, space is without structure. It is characterized by dimensions alone. For the naturalist, whether he says so or not, whether he's even aware of it or not, empty, unfilled space does not exist. He always conceives of real space and deals only with it. Now, Vernadsky conducted a survey of mathematician members of the Academy of Sciences, demanding to know, is there anything you can tell me from geometry which would account for the space which would allow for the characteristics manifested by living matter? In the 1938 essay, citing his correspondence with the mathematicians N.N. Luzin and S.P. Finikov, Vernadsky included hints about one of the geometries of the Riemannian type, which might be relevant, and called on geometers to take up the problem. From the final section of that essay, he said, scientific thought, or the life around us, confronts mathematical thinking with new problems. The geometrical character of the space occupied by living matter of the biosphere is such a new problem. Characteristic of that space are polar vectors, i.e. the absence of both a centre of symmetry and of complex symmetry, the non-equivalence of right and left-handedness, the marked chemical non-identity of right and left-handedness phenomena and its compounds and atomic structures, molecules and monocrystals. Characteristic is the conspicuous absence in living organisms of plane surfaces and straight lines. The symmetry of living organisms is distinguished by the curved lines and the curved surfaces characteristic of Riemannian geometries. One more identifying mark, which is usual for Riemannian geometries, is a finite enclosed space, sharply distinguished from its surroundings and autonomous. This is completely coherent with the character of aloofness of living organisms in the biosphere, their autarky. Vernadsky further developed these ideas in which what was to have been an article called Problems of Biochemistry 3, which were preserved as manuscript fragments under the title On the State of Physical Space. There Vernadsky wrote about the space occupied by living matter, and he said, the space cannot be Euclidean, if only because it lacks equivalence between right-handedness and left-handedness, that it is inevitable for Euclidean three-dimensional space. We may try to detect the geometric properties of this space. The following properties of Riemannian space suggest that it will correspond to one or several of the states of this space. Firstly, the fact that an infinite number of Riemannian spaces can exist. Secondly, that any Riemannian space is as if closed but appears to be unbounded. In three-dimensional Euclidean space, it will appear as a sphere. Thus, it has no straight lines nor plane surfaces, but only curved lines, and curved surfaces can exist. Vernadsky stated what he called the Curie principle, named after Pierre because of the latter's investigation of dissimetry, as a pervasive and fundamental principle. The Curie principle says dissymmetrical effects, that is phenomena, can be brought about by only a dissymmetrical cause. This precisely parallels the Redi principle, named after Francisco Redi from 1626 to 1697, which Vernadsky constantly emphasized, in which states that there is no abiogenesis, that life can only come from life. Vernadsky realized that if space is an intelligible reality governed everywhere by physical principles, and the principle of sufficient reason, then their causes and their effects must reside in the same state of space. That is, they must be embraced by a certain state of space. That's Curie's term. Not only does the Curie principle echo Redi's principle, but also Vernadsky closely linked together what they apply to, developing the idea that dissimetry and life were intertwined. Vernadsky understood that time, like Einstein, could not be separated from space, and that the characteristics of time were different for living and non-living processes. Vernadsky drew conclusions from his biogeochemical experience that the processes producing inert natural bodies would show cyclical, reversible, undirected character in the absence of living matter. The same minerals and rocks have been coming into being since the Cryptozoic, that's the Precambrian era, 4.6 billion years ago, until nowadays. The processes in which living bodies are involved, such as aging, the succession from one generation to the next, and evolution, show to the contrary their irreversibility. Now, some may wish these processes to be reversed, but we know that's impossible, right? Those things are the foundation of youth. Therefore, Vernadsky concluded that the processes in which inert natural bodies are involved are reversible, and those in which living bodies are involved are irreversible. Irreversibility is also called a polar vector of time, meaning a vector that has a pole at one end and only goes in one direction away from that pole. Living matter exists this irreversibility of polar vector time in that living organisms die. And evolution too is an irreversible process which takes place only among the living bodies of the earth. So here you have an entirely different, something entirely different from the statistical survival of the fitness, eugenics-driven formulas of Darwin and his minders. Rather, Vernadsky demonstrated the self-development of living processes, the special power of life itself. When you look at Vernadsky's discussion on the irreversibility of the development of living bodies over time, you really can't live backwards in time like Merlin the magician or in King Arthur's tales. You see that it is comparable to his discussion of the characteristics of the space of living matters. For a moment, think of this irreversibility of time as being like a spatial handedness, but for time. Indeed, Vernadsky never looked at space and time separately, but rather he used the term real space-time to denote the real time and the real space studied by the naturalist, though he remained unsatisfied in his search for their mathematical representation. Now, whilst Vernadsky left some of the questions unsettled, there also remains the question of the space-time properties of the Noosphere, his third and highest phase space, and I'll take that question up in the conclusion. But I first want to shift your attention to the freak-out that Vernadsky had already caused with his ideas of living and non-living phase spaces, as it has a real important meaning for our political organising as we move out of this conference. From what I've said so far, it's obvious why Vernadsky had been all but excised from the history books, until Lynn recognised his fundamental discoveries back in the 1940s. As you remember from Anne's presentation yesterday, that Thomas Huxley's prized pupil, H.G. Wells, already in his book in 1903, Anticipations, raved in favour of a ethical reconstruction of the culture of the entire world, with its intent to establish a world state, a one-world British imperial dictatorship. This was to be what Friedrich Nietzsche, the Satanist, and who was a co-thinker of Wells, termed the, quote, revaluation of all values. Premised upon Malthus and Darwin, that revaluation of values has spawned today's green fascist dictatorship over most of the world. The world of Vernadsky threatened to discredit the plot utterly in its early years. The founders of green fascism feared Vernadsky. They tried giving his work the silent treatment. They tried to divert attention to their own bogus explanations of life processes. Their agents inside the Soviet Union attacked him directly, and today there is a massive ongoing attempt to co-opt Vernadsky into the Green movement by lying about what his ideas were. A quick look at 4 people who did more than anyone to create green fascism will show you how these genocidalists reacted against Vernadsky and the completely unscientific hokum which they laid down at the foundation of today's environmentalism. The 4 are H.G. Wells himself, Wells's friend Sir Julian Huxley, a lifelong promoter of eugenics, who was the grandson of Darwin's bulldog. Then you got Max Nicholson, another eugenicist, who was a permanent private secretary to the Privy Council, and together with Huxley founded both the British Nature Conservancy and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, in 1948, and then the World Wildlife Fund in 1961. Nicholson was the acknowledged high priest of environmentalism in the post-World War II era. Among his other crimes, he helped set up the Australian Conservation Foundation. And Arthur Tansley, a product of Trinity College, Cambridge, and the Apostle Secret Society, personal protege of Bertrand Russell, and a Fabian socialist who led the establishment of ecology as a so-called science, and personally invented the concept of ecosystems. Darwinism gave birth to the so-called science of ecology, and ecology gave birth to environmentalism. Darwin's chief follower and publicist in Germany was Ernst Haeckel, a famous nutcase who invented the term ecology based upon Darwinism. By the beginning of the 20th century, the British were pushing this so-called new science of ecology in earnest. The leader of this push was Sir Arthur Tansley. He founded the British Ecological Society in 1913, the first such organisation in the world. Tansley's background: 3 years at Trinity College, Cambridge in the 1890s, informally adopted by the Apostles, follower of Bertrand Russell. A friend of Tansley's wrote, quote, "Tansley always said that he owed much more to the contemporary undergraduate society of Trinity than to any other influence at the university, most of all to Bertrand Russell, who had the most penetrating mind with which he came into contact and who was his favourite companion in midnight talks." I wonder where. Tansley's father was a Fabian socialist whose occupation was staging big parties for the oligarchy. Father and son taught at the Northern London Workmen's College founded by the Apostles. Its faculty was organised by yet another Fabian society, Francis Galton. As Anne reported, Galton was the founder of eugenics and was knighted by King Edward VII in 1909. Tansley specialised in botany at Trinity and taught there from 1907 to 1922. In the 1890s, Tansley became interested in Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis, which was brand new. Tansley even psychoanalysed Bertrand Russell. No mean task. The Apostles translated Freud and were his key promoters in Britain. Freud's whole argument, you probably know, is that inborn instincts determine everything a human being does in life, particularly their so-called sex drive, which is seen as fundamental. Now I get some people waking up. Just kidding. Tansley got so excited about psychoanalysis that he quit his post at Trinity in 1922 and went to Vienna to get personally psychoanalysed by Freud, and then he moved his whole family there in 1923 to 24. At that time, well over half of Freud's patients in Vienna were from Trinity College. In the 1920s, Tansley put out a book on Freud called The New Psychology and Its Relation to Life. In that book, Tansley presented the human mind in a typical Freudian way with his own special touches. Tansley gave a diagram of the mind as a combustion chamber in a mechanical engine, complete with energy flows labelled as psychic energy. The world outside impinges on the combustion chamber through sense certainty. The psychic energy gets stirred up and kaboom! It explodes and everything goes out of whack. Tansley, explicitly using language of the third law of thermodynamics, wrote that the task of psychoanalysts is to maintain equilibrium within the combustion chamber, that is, within your mind. In 1922, on the processes of nature, including mankind, Tansley spelled this out with, "We see varied special cases of the great universal law of equilibrium, which governs all the processes of which we have any knowledge, from the movements of the planets to those of molecules, atoms and electrons, from the activity of protoplasm to the vagaries of the human mind." If you think this sounds like Herbert Spencer, you're right. Tansley was a disciple of Spencer. He even wrote a whole chapter for one of Spencer's books. But Tansley in 1932 wrote the following about the processes of life, again parroting Spencer, where he said, quote, "Its power of arresting entropy is a partial, local and temporary power that is perfectly intelligible physically, and that cannot arrest the process of equalization in the distribution of energy throughout the universe at large, a process that will ultimately bring about conditions under which the protoplasmic units cannot continue to exist." That's just what he's saying about life. It was in a paper published in 1935, which the British Imperial Thought Police then promoted like crazy, that Tansley proclaimed the existence of ecosystems. In typical empiricist fashion, he defined an ecosystem from the bottom up, presenting it as a collection of particular things, such as various plants, trees, animals. According to Tansley, the essence of an ecosystem is abiotic thermodynamic energy flows among its constituents, beginning with energy of food that is ingested. He wrote, "All living organisms may be regarded as machines, transforming energy from one form into another, for instance from the potential energy locked up in the molecules of organic food to the kinetic energy seen in motion of the body." Elsewhere, Tansley argued explicitly that these abiotic energy flows produce biotic phenomena, and the biotic phenomena produce the mind. In other words, no phase spaces such as Vernadsky had already identified. In Tansley's scheme, life is merely a spin-off, an epiphenomenon of non-life. And the mind, but not really the mind as you can see, rather only the brain is merely a spin-off, an epiphenomenon of living phenomena. What Tansley laid out there is the guts of what underlies the British hatred of Vernadsky, and what these circles deployed against him and against humanity. In the case of Wells, Huxley and some of their key collaborators, we can see how their frenzy was provoked directly by Vernadsky. They sprang into action after Vernadsky's 1922-23 lectures at the Sorbonne and the publication of his book in French in 1924. In the audience at the Sorbonne were two friends named Edouard LaRouche and Teilhard de Chardin, a Jesuit priest. Clearly sparked by Vernadsky, these two guys came up with the term Noösphere, which Chardin in particular publicised worldwide until his death in 1954. Chardin was a top agent in the cultural warfare operations of British intelligence, including the famous Piltdown Man hoax of 1913. Darwinism was flagging a little bit at the time because with a surge in the study of genetics, many people thought the genes determined hereditary, i.e. the nature of the species, etc., rather than Darwin's theory of natural selection. Along came Chardin on a visit to Britain from France. He went to a quarry at Piltdown, East Sussex, and together with two guys from the British Museum, which is one of the very top cultural institutions in Britain, all of a sudden discovered a missing link. A missing link between ape and man, that is. It was dubbed the Piltdown Man, and it gave Darwinism a new lease of life. Some people were suspicious of the new find even at that time, but it was only decades later that the Piltdown Man was demonstrated to be a composite of a human skull from medieval times, a 500-year-old lower jaw from a Sarawak orangutan, and fossilised chimpanzee's teeth filed down to simulate worn human teeth. And Teilhard de Chardin, one of the main fraudsters in the Piltdown Man hoax, got the reputation of being the chief proponent and populariser of the Noösphere concept. But Chardin's Noösphere, like Vernadsky's, ends in the omega point, the final equilibrium of mind and matter, just as Herbert Spencer had taught. Chardin was a promoter of eugenics. Then there was the Anglo-Soviet face of British intelligence operations against Vernadsky. In 1924, the year after Vernadsky's Sorbonne lectures, the British biologist J.B.S. Haldane and Soviet biochemist A.I. Oparin each suddenly came out with what was quickly named the Oparin-Haldane thesis, stating that all life evolves from the non-living. Oparin argued that way back in geological time, a combination of basic organic chemicals had formed into microscopic localized systems as precursors of the single cell from which primitive living things could develop. Oparin wrote, quote, "There is no fundamental difference between a living organism and lifeless matter. The complex combination of manifestations and properties so characterized of life must have arisen in the process of the evolution of matter." Haldane was a top figure in British intelligence. The sudden appearance of this anti-Vernadsky thesis in both Britain and the Soviet Union simultaneously was no big surprise when you know how the British had orchestrated the Russian revolutions of the 1917 period. Not to mention the fact that the Cambridge apostles had invented socialism in the first place. The way history unfolded, the Soviet Union turned out not to be the totally controlled puppet of the British that the British strategists had intended to create. Lenin and then Stalin, in their own ways, both reflected the deep influence of the American system in Russia. But the British still had many agents in the Soviet Union, and the official state ideology of the dialectical materialism was a child of British empiricism. H.G. Wells personally launched another major British operation against Vernadsky while not daring to utter his name. In 1925, the year after Vernadsky's book on geochemistry appeared in French, H.G. Wells, Julian Huxley and Wells' son, G.P. Wells of Trinity College, started a crash program to write the definitive book on biology, ecology and life in general. It came out 4 years later in 1929 under the title The Science of Life. Think about that. H.G. Wells was the best-selling author in the entire world. His outline of history sold more copies than any other book besides the Bible and the Quran. Huxley was a famous zoologist, and he quit his best-paying job in zoology in Britain overnight in order to devote his full time to this project. Fortunately, I don't have time to tell you much about the contents of his 4-inch thick tome, but it is very nasty. Among other things, the authors claim that life comes from non-life and the mind does not exist, only the brain does. The whole chapter is entitled The Science of Ecology. Its theme is that human economics is merely a subset of animal ecology, or biological economics as they put it. Like Darwin, they insist that man is nothing but a small piece of nature that is not qualitative different in the least. When Tansley came out with the Ecosystems article in 1935, Wells, Huxley and Wells issued a new edition of their book to play up the new hoax. H.G. Wells died in 1945. Huxley, Tansley and Max Nicholson went on to set up all the founding institutions of modern environmentalism, the IUCN, the WWF, and even more important, the British Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy is the mother of the world's entire green fascist movement. It was founded in 1948. Tansley was the first head of the Nature Conservancy, and Nicholson succeeded him. Furthermore, the Nature Conservancy was given royal status as one of the 4 permanent royal research bodies directed under the Privy Council. Its agenda was one world government and mass murder through eugenics. One of Tansley's earlier articles from 1939 had already made this very clear. Under the heading Human Ecology, he wrote, quote, "In the phase through which humanity is now passing, we see the trend towards internationalism, with World Federation as its ultimate goal, the establishment of a worldwide ecosystem arising inevitably from the increased interdependence of the people, the multiplication of the bonds between them. Unless indeed the human race shows itself ultimately incapable of effecting the new adjustments, the necessary new steps towards worldwide integration, and in that case it must relapse into disintegrated barbarism, made all the more horrible by its scientific equipment. From the start, Tansley, like Huxley and Nicholson, raved against alleged world overpopulation. And they didn't just rave, they acted. One of the first studies the Nature Conservancy conducted under its leadership in the early 1950s was the effect of DDT on birds. They would put 10,000 times as much DDT onto birds and their eggs as they could ever conceivably get otherwise, and some of the birds died. In 1962, Rachel Carson of the Nature Conservancy's branch in America issued her book Silent Spring, based on this research, with the intent to have DDT banned, and it ultimately was. Probably hundreds of millions of human beings have died needlessly due to that ban. The Nature Conservancy also deployed 2 of its top agents to Australia with devastating results. Derek Ovington helped set up the ACF and in 1973 became the first head of our national park system, which was designed to lock up land preventing development. Over 12% of our entire country is now affected. Second was Peter Bridgewater, probably the key in the plot to shut down the Murray-Darling Basin. He was the point man in Australia for Ramsar, the international wetlands dictatorship set up by Max Nicholson in 1971. Bridgewater had been the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy from 1989 to 90, and he was sent to Australia to succeed Ovington as the head of the National Park System. What? We couldn't find an Australian? After heading our park system for a decade, Bridgewater became the International Secretary General of Ramsar. But the plot is to shut down not just Australia, of course, but the entire world. Today, the world's supposed authorities and Vernadskys have come up with a new hoax intended to bury the real Noösphere. They have proclaimed the Anthropocene era. This notion mimics Vernadsky's Noosphere. The Anthropocene era scheme states that man is now the dominant geological force upon the earth, but they continue that that is a catastrophe. Promoters of the Anthropocene era doctrine, like Hans Joachim Schellenhuber, whom, as you know, our youth just nailed as a genocidalist here in Australia this month, demands that human beings shut down essentially all industrial production, or else the whole earth will die. It is clear that reviving the true work and the output of the immortal genius Vladimir Vernadsky is one of our most powerful weapons to defeat green fascism. So now that you have a sense of the terror that the British Empire has had and still has against Vernadsky's work, I want to move now to a discussion of the most profound element of that work, which is the concept of the Noösphere. Because around the time of Vernadsky's death in 1945, a young man in his 20s, Lyndon LaRouche, came to recognise the importance of Vernadsky's work just in the period when he was refuting the systems analysis and information theory hoaxes of Bertrand Russell's protégés Norman Wiener and John von Neumann. Wiener and Neumann were attempting in typical Sarpian fashion to reduce everything in the universe down to simple arithmetic, statistical and linear modes with no respect for the principles of Vernadsky or LaRouche had recognised as governing the planet. Over the last 6 decades, LaRouche has carried Vernadsky's key conceptions to higher levels than originally specified by Vernadsky, especially the conceptions of the 3 phase spaces, the non-living, living and noetic, or the Noosphere. Secondly, LaRouche has defined the principle of the principle of physical economic non-entropy as a necessary functional character of the Noosphere. During the many years since his famous lectures in Paris in 1922 to 23, Vernadsky developed his concept of the Noosphere in more and more profound ways, culminating in the optimism that's clearly audible in the 1938 article on the fundamental material energetic distinction between living and non-living natural bodies of the biosphere, where he says, this is Vernadsky, we are living in a brand new bright geological epoch. Man, through his labour and through his conscious relationship to life, is transforming the envelope of the earth, the geological region of life, the biosphere. Man is shifting it into a new geological state. Through his labour and his consciousness, the biosphere is in a process of transition to the Noösphere. Man is creating new biochemical processes which never existed before. The biochemical history of the chemical elements, a planetary phenomenon, is drastically changing. Enormous masses of new, free metals and their alloys are being created on Earth. For examples, ones which never existed before, such as aluminium, magnesium and calcium. Plants and animal life are being changed and disturbed in the most drastic manner. New species and races are being created. The face of the Earth is changing profoundly. The stage of the Noosphere is being created. Within the Earth's biosphere, an intense blossoming is in process, the further history of which will be grandiose, it seems to us. In this geological process, which is fundamentally biogeochemical, a single individual unit of living matter out of the total of humanity, a great personality, whether a scientist, an inventor, or a statesman, can be of fundamental, decisive, directing importance and can manifest himself as a geological force. This sort of manifestation of individuality in processes of enormous biogeochemical importance is a new planetary phenomenon. It emerged and began to manifest itself even more sharply and profoundly in the course of time, during the most recent tens of thousands of years, on the background of billions of years of prior history of the biosphere when this phenomenon did not exist. For Vernadsky, his concept of the Noosphere was not a religious or philosophical idea, but grounded in scientific method. He himself said that it was grounded above all in his work on physical economy. Vernadsky's discussion on the physical economy as the Noosphere is coherent with LaRouche's idea of physical economy as the highest science. In 1994, LaRouche wrote a very important set of essays called The Science of Physical Economy as a Platonic epistemological basis of all branches of human knowledge. Vernadsky's account of the matter is stated right at the outset of one of his last articles called Some Words About the Noosphere, written by Vernadsky, which was written in 1943 and first published in English in 1945, where he said, "In my own scientific work," he wrote, "the First World War was reflected in a most decisive way. It radically changed my geological conception of the world. It is in the atmosphere of that war that I have approached a conception of nature at a time forgotten, and thus new for myself and for others, a geochemical and biogeochemical conception embracing both non-living and living nature from the same point of view." 28 years ago in 1915, a commission for the study of productive forces of our country, the so-called KEPS, was formed at the Academy of Sciences. That commission, of which I was elected president, played a noticeable role in the critical period of the First World War. Entirely unexpectedly, in the midst of the war, it became clear to the Academy of Sciences that in this Tsarist Russia there were no precise data concerning the now so-called strategic raw minerals. In developing his concept of the Noosphere, Vernadsky drew upon many great minds of the past. In this essay, Some Words About the Noosphere, he presented the idea of life as a cosmic phenomenon and quoted from the 17th century Dutch scientist and teacher of Leibniz, Christian Huygens, who in his posthumously published book, Cosmotheros, offered the scientific generalization, life is a cosmic phenomenon in some way sharply distinct from non-living matter. Vernadsky calls this the Huygens principle. As part of trying to determine why man has become a geological force, Vernadsky looked at the work of James Dana and Joseph LeConte, who both expounded the view that the evolution of living matter is proceeding in a definite direction. This phenomenon was called by Dana cephalization, referring to the development of the more powerful brains, and by Leconte as the Psychozoic era you heard earlier, both of which are the same idea. Vernadsky also quoted another Russian scientist, a geologist by the name of A.P. Pavlov, who had spoken of the anthropogenic era and said that man was becoming a mighty and ever-growing geological force, and that this geological force was formed imperceptibly over a long period of time. We can now see where the unique work of Lyndon LaRouche is crucial, because by itself the concept of cephalization does not adequately explain the process whereby man has become a mighty geological force. Vernadsky, I think, knew this, and from what I understand, he was going to write more on the elaborated concept of the noosphere in the third and final section of the book he was working on when he died, but it remained incomplete. However, in some words about the noosphere, Vernadsky posed a riddle. He stated, "The noosphere is a new geological phenomenon on our planet. In it, for the first time, man becomes a large-scale geological force. He can and must rebuild the providence of his life by his work and thought, rebuild it radically in comparison to the past. Wider and wider creative possibilities open before him. It may be that the generation of our grandchildren will approach their blossoming. Here a new riddle has arisen before us. Thought is not a form of energy. How then can it change material processes?" Vernadsky, throughout his life's work, scientifically demonstrated the unbridgeable gap between inert and living processes. He demonstrated the absolutely different space-time characteristics between inert and living matter. LaRouche has continued to demonstrate, using Vernadsky's own standard of empirical scientific generalizations, that there is another unbridgeable gap between the species natures of us human beings who reside in Vernadsky's noosphere and all other living processes. This unbridgeable gap has been empirically demonstrated by the fact that the human species has been able, through deliberate willful changes in the improvements both in individuals and in human society as a whole, to increase our overall population 1,000-fold over the course of the time that man has been on Earth. No other living creature can willfully increase its overall population, or, to use the scientific term from LaRouche's physical economy, its relative potential population density in this way. This is purely a characteristic of mankind. Therefore, man is therefore not an animal conforming to the population and biospheric constraints of other animals. We are a species set apart from all other species by our unique capacity of the willful use of the creative powers of individual human reason to discover and assimilate and apply new scientific principles to the biosphere. This willful creative quality makes us imago vividae, the living image of God, and to participate in his creation. From the standpoint of physical economy, LaRouche defined the principle of physical economic non-entropy as the property of the noosphere, which explains how man has become a growing geological force. He says in the Truth About Temporal Eternity paper, from the standpoint, LaRouche says, of physical economy, the validity of a scientific discovery lies in the demonstrable relative validity of the principle of discovery, the Platonic higher hypothesis, which governs both the generation and also the demonstration of that specific hypothesis. The relative validity of that higher hypothesis, thus subsuming a generation of particular hypotheses, is shown to physical economy by increase of the potential population density of that society which governs its investment and production policies according to such higher hypotheses, or which perversely demonstrably fails as a consequence of failing to do so. The validity of a mode of hypothesizing the higher hypothesis is measured in terms of the study of human history and prehistory from the same standpoint of the science of physical economy. Now, if you reflect back to Curie's discovery of radioactivity and the whole host of new radioactive elements, this was a scientific discovery of a new higher hypothesis. When they started their work, the Curies, like Becquerel, encountered a strange phenomenon within uranium rocks that could not be accounted for within any existing body of knowledge. We can call that existing body of knowledge an existing hypothesis. Through the process of scientific investigation, quite often operating on intuition hints alone, the Curies discovered radioactivity, a new physical principle that transformed the previous existing poorer body of knowledge. They hypothesized. That is, they applied the process of discovery and discovered a higher hypothesis, radioactivity. In other words, there was a major change in the way phenomena were looked at based on the discovery of this new principle of radioactivity. As we have witnessed, the development of nuclear power sources has provided a massive increase in the potential free energy available for mankind, and when it is actually applied, this is shown to the physical economy in the increase of the potential population density of that society. Nuclear power gives us several magnitudes greater energy flux densities than do coal or petroleum-based fuels, meaning that new, more efficient processes can be developed above and beyond the existing body of knowledge based on lower energy flux density forms. Another simple example is to compare the horse and cart with a modern truck. The process of human creativity has made the necessary discoveries of physical principles to harness the energy to do more work for society as a whole. Tom Lord of Transport would have a great deal of difficulty employing horse and carts in their line of work. And I can't even imagine a cart-mounted crane. But the process does not stop at any given discovery of one principle. Human beings can go on hypothesizing the higher hypothesis all the time, which is the reason the population of this planet has increased at an exponential rate, and that man has become a geological force. There is a constant process of change from a lower form of technology to a higher, and then a higher, further change, then the higher further change form after that. And the process of change here is known as the invariant of the invariant, or the process of hypothesizing the higher hypothesis. Mr. LaRouche and the basement team have warned starkly over the past several weeks that our planet and the populations on it face a mass extinction threat due to the changing position of our solar system in the plane of the galaxy. We're moving to the upper region above the plane of our galaxy, which will expose us to more and more cosmic radiations. We've been witnessing over the last year an increasing frequency of phenomena like large earthquakes and tsunamis, and we are at the mercy of the galaxy, whose cyclical conditions could wipe us out. As you have heard from Anne, this pattern of extinctions is not new. It's happened several times in the long life of the Earth, just not during the short time that man has been around. Over 95% of all the living species that ever existed have gone extinct because they were not able to control or modify their environment or change their environment in order to survive galactic events like the ones we're now facing. However, human beings can and must change their environment. In order to protect ourselves right now, we need to employ those powers of scientific discovery which are uniquely ours as human beings created in Imago Dei to make the discoveries necessary to harness the energy sources such as fusion power and then matter-antimatter reactions. This requires us to search for the physical principles that make these energies possible, just like the Curies did. And with the new technologies we shall develop on the basis of those principles, and we shall transform the biosphere even further and work towards protecting our population from horrific galactic events. But the sticking point for us today is to really understand that unlike other animals, which we are not, if we don't listen to Sapien Company and become defined by our pathetic senses, but actually define ourselves by our godlike creative reason. And this quality of creative reason does not exist in the brain per se, the physical organ, but rather in the mind, for which the brain acts as some sort of antenna resonating with this principle. LaRouche said in his paper, At the Brink of Confusion When Governments Crumble, quote, "Mankind has a mind, or the ability to manifest a mind which is independent of sense perception. Modern science gives us a very clear picture of that kind of evidence, that what we know in the discovery of principles is that the power of the human mind, the so-called creative powers, the powers to create a new state of mind, involve demonstrations of the use of artificial senses, as in the form of our sense perceptions, as the faculties of our mind. Most people who are ignorant of this will assume that you can trace what people think and how they think to the powers located in sense perception, or in the so-called animal sense perception, or the biological sense perception. That is not true. The human mind is not a product of a mere brain, nor of sense perception, but is actually a product of what we might call cosmic radiation, a particular feature of cosmic radiation which gives man a special power that no other living species has. So within Vernadsky's Noosphere, man has become a large-scale geological force because of the unique quality located in the mind of man, which is necessarily in harmony with the processes of the cosmos in which it exists. So coming back to the Vernadsky's riddle that thought is not a form of energy, it appears that thought, or creative reason, is in fact the most powerful force in the universe, as we have discussed within LaRouche's work, and is the mover of the large-scale geological force of man. Willful human creative reason, as a reflection of the universal principle of creativity, also defines a new space-time geometry for the Noösphere, just as non-life and life have their own Euclidean reversible or Riemannian irreversible characteristics respectively. Ask yourself this: what are the characteristics of space and time in which valid ideas exist? What are the characteristics of the space and time that human beings can exist in if they don't reduce themselves down to being mere animals? Well, that's the meaning of that painting over there where we started the conference yesterday morning. The realm of ideas and thought. Looking at the painting as demonstrated by the School of Athens, what is the character of the space and the ideas of this person here? In 100 years clock time, has the space within those ideas as they exist today changed in the mind of the person here? The space-time of the Noosphere is universal and immortal. Living organisms and inert matter die and erode away. Their physical manifestations disappear and are absorbed into the biosphere. But we remember the name Marie Curie as the discovery of the principle of radioactivity, or Lyndon LaRouche as the inventor of relative potential population density. Their physical manifestations will disappear, but their ideas and discoveries will live on. So I'd like to close this presentation and this conference with these very noble ideas in your minds. And it's from something that Lynn said just a Saturday ago. And he said, "Only humanity has a sense of a higher purpose for anything that humanity is going to do, that the individual is going to participate in, and that is the advancement of the human species to be, in effect, an immortal species. The individual member of the species may die, but the contribution which they contribute in their role in the universe is immortal. And the intention to an immortal purpose and end is the essence of what mankind requires as the motivation to secure the future for humanity in a higher form. So we go from a lower form in which the human species is vulnerable is fit only for extinction under conditions which are developing now into a higher form in which the human species has increased its power in the universe as a means of expressing the human role in a higher form in the universe at large. It's the meaning of human life. Only human life, in as far as we know life, in any part of the world. We may discover a lot of things out there like that, but we don't know them yet. We have no evidence they exist. But we do know about humanity, that humanity has an immortal mission to develop our skills, our capabilities. So we go from a lower form of life to a higher form of life without any necessary other biological transformations. Biological evolution is an irrelevant thing in this matter. It's the increase in man's power. Thank you.